Welcome to the CIO Evolution. In this podcast, we'll explore the Chief Information Officer's role in executing a new ongoing leadership imperative, digital transformation that promotes agility and resilience. How do CIOs upgrade legacy networks? What are the financial challenges CIOs face? And what are the security measures that are required in the new work from anywhere, mobile and cloud-based world?
I'm Phil Armstrong, and I'm delighted to be your host of the CIO Evolution podcast. Today, we'll discuss the rapidly evolving cybersecurity landscape from the perspective of solution longevity and outsourcing. I'm delighted to be joined by Kevin Dawson, the President and CEO of ISA Cybersecurity, and Sean Cordero, host of the CISO's Gambit and CISO Americas at Zscaler. Let's start with a quick round of introductions if we can. Kevin, may I ask you to start?
Sure. Thanks, Phil. My name is Kevin Dawson, as Phil mentioned, CEO and President of ISA Cybersecurity. I've been in the technology space for the better part of almost 30 years now, since the early 90s. Started my career at Hewlett-Packard and joined ISA, where I am today, in the mid to late 90s. And kind of lived in the world of cybersecurity since 1997. Took over and started running the company about 8 years ago now. And so I'm an avid outdoorsman, but a little bit of a geek at heart as it relates to cybersecurity.
Perfect. Sean?
Thank you for having me today, and thank you for mentioning the CISO's Gambit. Appreciate that. So yeah, Sean Cordero. I've kicking about 23, almost 24 years now in IT and information security. Former CISO of a handful of publicly traded companies across financials and also retail, some time in healthcare and biotechnology. A lot of the work that I've done over the few years have been focused on developing international standards for cybersecurity, most notably the Cloud Controls Matrix by the Cloud Security Alliance. And here at Zscaler, I serve as an advisor to our largest customers, where I provide subject matter expertise on the subject of zero trust, security program development, and also assisting them with achieving maximum value out of their Zscaler solutions.
Thank you, Sean. Welcome, gentlemen. Let's dive right in. So I remember the challenges that I faced as a global CIO, trying to patch together a set of solutions to comprehensively address my organization's varied needs to defend against this constantly evolving cybersecurity landscape and the threats. Just as I thought I was making some really good progress, a specific tool or capability would be compromised, maybe rendered ineffective, or bought by a competing vendor, introducing incompatibilities, or perhaps it even became economically unattractive and introduced instability. I was constantly assessing options and gauging compatibility. So let me start by asking you, Kevin, from the work that you do with your clients in this industry, what components of cyber coverage have you seen that are starting to look a little tired and perhaps vulnerable due to the changing business models and obsolescence, or maybe even new emerging superior solutions?
Well, great question, Phil. And I think it goes a step earlier than that in terms of, and I'll address the question of technologies and specific things that might be lagging or might be what they call technical debt in organizations. But I think it steps back to kind of how the decisions are made in the first place for various different solutions, and how they continue to be made by organizations, and looking at it or not looking at it from more of a risk lens. I don't think there's anywhere else in the industry where what we do is more akin to kind of the cat and the mouse, and kind of the back and forth, trying to foil the other. And so we see it every day. And what happens is the latest exploit or the latest threat gets a lot of publicity, a lot of noise. Various different vendors tie themselves around a capability that helps prevent that threat or vulnerability, and then people go running to the store to pull it off the shelves and buy that technology and implement. Aspect of looking at why they're actually buying and looking at what the actual risk profile of the organization is as it relates to that, that's a missing gap. And then really the governance after they implement the tools. I will say that to answer your original question in the technology space, I think there's a lot of companies with, I'll say some lagging endpoint platform technologies. There's been a lot of advances over the past 2 to 4 years in that area, and a lot of companies are still living off of older protection mechanisms and older technologies in that space. Which, candidly, we talk about vulnerabilities. We talk about vulnerability scanning as a tool to scan an environment, but ultimately one of your largest vulnerabilities are your people, and they live and breathe on endpoints and on devices. So that's an area where I've seen significant technical debt and then significant ageism in terms of technologies from a cyber perspective in organizations.
And Sean, what are you seeing?
A lot of the things that were just discussed, I agree with. Interestingly, though, there is another area that is directly related to a lot of the concerns of the CIO and also of the CISO or the CSO. And that's actually cyber insurance. So cyber insurance is one of these things that to me was always a joke. I remember working both with clients, myself as a CISO, getting the questionnaire, and it'd be like 3 or 4 pages. You had to handwrite it, scan it, and then send it back. This wasn't that long ago, by the way, because a lot of these large insurers, they have these sub-teams that have gotten into the cyber business and haven't yet built the capability to do both the actuarial component and the actual operational piece. So when I think about legacy, outdated things, absolutely, the technology, we've seen it time and time again, both from a process, whether that's a waterfall-based development that a lot of organizations still do, whether that is the standard change control process that a lot of infrastructure teams still live and die by. Those things are in need of an overhaul and fundamental change, and arguably that's already happened from a development standpoint. But then you put it in the context of the insurance space, and you start realizing that, wait a minute, we know as practitioners, as leaders, that we're not 100% in our technology, yet we're still getting insured, and it starts creating this whole head scratching kind of phenomenon. Now, interestingly, I've seen a lot of these insurers start changing the way that they're going about it. And in fact, I highly suspect that a lot of the large insurance companies will probably opt out. But instead, what we're seeing is these bespoke, very purpose-built, cyber-focused, risk-focused new organizations that are focused on actually doing things like Kevin had mentioned, which is ensuring that you're not just getting a questionnaire and a self-attestation, which we all know how useful that is, but doing a high level, or in some cases, a very detailed assessment with qualified personnel that can then allow them to go back to their underwriting, go to their actuarials, and be able to provide meaningful data. Because at the moment, the way that the cyber industry from an insurance standpoint works, good luck trying to get a claim in.
Sean, I couldn't agree with you more. It's an area, we offer a digital forensics incident response practice, and it's an area that we see. We work with insurance companies, and I think you're exactly right. In fact, the pendulum is swinging the opposite way. I mean, you look at, we had a customer scenario 3 years ago, not just under 3 years ago today, where we're in there and we're doing forensics, and the team identifies that we need to deploy a tool. And the carrier says, well, wait a minute. They checked off on the checklist. They have that tool. And then obviously the client, the victim gets in the line, and there's now a 3-way conversation, and the breach coach and the carrier are saying, well, wait a minute. The investigators are saying they need to deploy a tool, but you said you had that. And the client said, well, yeah, when we did the renewal, we had bought it. We just hadn't implemented it yet. And we're still working on that. And that's the thing. And so you're exactly right. Those checklists, and it's not, and you joked about not that long ago. This was 3 years ago. Customer did a checklist, and it was just yes, 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 yes. And no test against, yes, we have the people in place to make these tools work. Yes, we have the processes and the governance and all the things that are important. It's just a capabilities matrix. And do you have this thing? And we're seeing it like you are. And I think, as I said, the pendulum's swinging the other way, because the carriers, unfortunately, are absolutely bleeding with claims loss ratios 400 and 500% over the past couple of years. So at least in Canada, we're seeing a lot of carriers either get out of the space or decline coverage or decline renewals just because of the increased risk that comes with that. So it is a big area that people have traditionally, and like you said, jokingly looked at as a risk mitigation strategy to have cyber insurance and just go buy my cyber insurance. Well, the prices are going up, the coverage is going down, or some are getting out of it altogether. And organizations are going to have to look internally first before externally as their risk mitigation. So I couldn't agree more with you.
And fascinating, we're having this cyber insurance discussion right on the back of the Merck decision where their claims were denied by their insurer. They took them to court and have recently just won that decision. Their insurer citing an act of war. And of course, ransomware is not really an act of war. But it is interesting how insurance companies are now going to tighten up the front end, the qualification process, the questions that they ask, how deeper they're going to dig. And as you say, not just look for evidence that you've got a particular function covered, but that it's installed, that it's sustainable, that it's effective, etc., before you even get in the door to talk about cyber insurance. And then the wording on the contracts themselves, they're going to learn from these failed denials. And they're going to tighten up that exclusionary wording where it's almost getting to the point where, is it worth having cyber insurance if I'm going to be precluded and excluded from a lot of these events? So watch this space. Definitely
a lot of them are excluding.
Interesting.
A lot of them are excluding ransomware already, and it's a major threat. So you're buying auto insurance without collision, sort of thing.
So Kevin, is it worth spending extra money because the price is going up to get cyber insurance, or is it better just not having cyber insurance and spending that money on better functional cyber protection? Now, in some industries, regulators are forcing you to get cyber insurance, but if it's quite ineffective.
Yeah, I don't think it's a situation of you shouldn't bother getting it. That's never the case. I think it's applicable. It is a risk mitigation that a lot of organizations look at. I think it falls back to, I guess, again, as Sean was saying, some of the fundamentals that companies are not doing that the insurance companies or the insurance carriers look for. And these are dependent on your size as an organization. Presumably, and the actuaries say that your risk matrix goes up the larger your size. But some of the fundamental, I'm going to say, coverage or some fundamental platforms, technologies, pieces, capabilities the organization should have are not always in place. And then the piece of evaluating somebody's risk. I know, as Sean said, there's some new niche players that are coming up that haven't quite felt the pain of the long-term players that have been in the space for, in some cases, 100 years, and in some cases in the cyberspace for 15, 20 years, who are just trying to get back to zero if they can. And some of these new players are trying to use kind of automation tools to do a similar thing. And we've seen them with clients, and they very mostly have an external perspective, looking from the outside in, which is good, but it's just one lens of kind of the threat landscape. It's somebody looking at your house and saying, it looks like all your windows and doors are locked from the outside, but when you get inside, what does that look like? And what are the cadence? What are the things you do? Do you set the alarm when you walk inside? That sort of thing. So I think there's some work to be done in maturity, and we're starting to see it big time in the notion of third-party risk assessments. A couple of years ago, you might have one or two come across your desk, and they were more aimed at whether you could do the job that you were being hired to do, not could you do the job securely that you're being hired to do if you're a supplier to an organization. So can you make the widgets in a timely fashion? Now we're seeing those third-party risks happening all the time. And there is a strong cyber component to them to not only can you do the service that you say you can do, or build the widget or build the product that you say you can do as part of my supply chain, but how are you doing it in a secure fashion and those controls? And so in the third-party risk area, they're actually, I would say, a little bit ahead of the insurance carriers in terms of going a step further in evaluating companies. And the third-party risk, I guess, assessments work that they do oftentimes comes with a body, an auditor coming in saying, okay, well, show me these controls. And if this is a control you do around evaluating people and doing background checks on people, how many people have you joined in the last year? Well, these 4. Okay, great. I want to pick these 2 and show me you did these control things like SOC 2 audit, ISO certification, do a lot of these things. And you're seeing that span over into these third-party risk assessments, as well as span over to the carrier space as well, where you have that independent party or independent third person, not a self-attestation, as Sean put it. You have that third party saying, hey, yeah, I've looked at these this organization and they check these boxes. And by the way, they have these ones that are still open. So you understand truly, I guess, the overall risk lens of that organization.
And Sean, maybe a question for you. If you talk to a lot of CISOs, if I'm a CIO and I'm sat down with my CISO, what are CISOs communicating to their CIOs these days around functions that maybe we need to pay a little bit more attention to, or maybe we need to look at different types of technologies and architectures out there? What are looking a little pale and old in the marketplace these days? Is there any specific areas that CIOs need to be sort of really paying attention to?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's technology that's been out there, technology that I personally deployed 20 some years ago that is still the de facto method of deploying networks and security. And you start looking at it from a business standpoint, you start realizing, wait a minute, why am I still investing in the way we did it before? And all of a sudden you're back to business class 101 and it's the sunk cost fallacy and everybody's going, it's just the way it is. And then you can't hire the right people. And ultimately you end up not hiring, let's say, cybersecurity experts. You start hiring very verticalized niche tool experts. Mm-hmm. And that unfortunately is a losing proposition. And if you look at the results of IT and security as a whole, it's kind of failed. And, that's definitely on the shoulders of CIOs and CISOs combined. One could make an argument that more so on the CTO CIO side, because they've been in the seat for much longer and they've traditionally controlled budget much longer. All of that being said, though, I think there is a lack of candor across the executive side between what's real and what isn't. What are we concerned about? What are we not concerned about? And kind of tying it back to what we were talking about from a cyber insurance standpoint, it's the exact same exercise. And what's really interesting to me is that earlier, Kevin had mentioned that there's this enormous focus on third-party risk management, right? So what I foresee happening is specifically in the context of outsourcers, in the context of cloud services, you almost end up in that model that everybody used to point to in the late 90s, early 2000s, saying, we're going to have a governance model over all of our outsourcers. And don't worry, yes, your job is disappearing, but you're now going to be in a leadership role over 100 contractors. This scares a lot of IT people and a lot of security people, as it should, because we know that model didn't really work out so well. But when you think about it, does that mean that the role of IT and the role of security moving forward is just going to be one of administrative oversight and a little bit of sprinkling of governance? Is there another industry that is currently struggling with that model that actually gets paid to do that and makes money when it works, but loses money when it doesn't? Oh yeah, cyber insurance. That's the model. And we know how well that's going. So to me, the whole thing is interconnected, and it's a little laughable and very scary because it requires some very deep introspection as industry leaders and professionals to say, hey, listen, it's not just about the technology, the way that we're going about it overall, the way we're hiring, the fact that we're looking for, I'll give you an example, people with 7 years of a particular cloud technology that's been out for 3. How does that happen? This is very common. So that tells me that there's a lot of leaders, and I'm talking leaders at large organizations with huge amounts of responsibility, that perhaps it's gotten away from them and maybe they've lost the plot. And I've also seen it at small organizations as well. But the point is that we have an opportunity as an industry to really take a deep step back and partner on finding other ways about doing things, because what we know for a fact, it just hasn't been working. The most disruptive technologies come out of primarily cloud-based computing over the last decade, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. So I think it's a time for introspection and a time of action, because without action, we'll just end up doing the same episode in a decade and lamenting how nothing ever occurred.
I think in the past, though, CIOs were fairly reticent around outsourcing components of their cybersecurity services. Perhaps they were comfortable with maybe lower value commodity type services, but I see that changing quite a bit, especially as they struggle to keep up with the marketplace and have access to this really hard to find talent. Kevin, you must be seeing some different patterns emerging in terms of outsourcing and the opinion towards outsourcing certain services within your cyber portfolio.
Yeah, and to play on what Sean said, it's the technology piece. A lot of organizations look for, I need this skill set on this specific technology, whether it be a cloud thing that's only existed for 3 years and they want 7 years, or whatever the technology is. And so when organizations engage us in our MSSP practice in either a managed or hosted capacity, it's usually for that specific piece. They want that technology expertise. They want an outcome. They want us to come in and provide an outcome. The technology becomes almost not irrelevant, but secondhand, because there's multiple technologies in each area. And I'm going to say, there's no shortage of technology. I lean to kind of the automotive sector right now, where there's lots of people that can drive, that want to drive, but there's a chip shortage. So there's no cars being available. You go to our space, there's lots of technology. I can go download the latest technology. It's available on most websites. I can get it the same day, even if it's an appliance space. Those appliances are coming out fairly quick. There's no technology shortage, but we don't have drivers. We don't have people in the car. And so that's the piece that's missing a lot in our customers. And that's where they look to us. And even if you find that person, like Sean said, they're moving around a lot because of the natural laws of supply and demand. And so when you have a larger organization that only focuses on cyber, that has a depth of people, they can survive losing 1, 2, 10%, 15%, 20%. Whereas organizations that add this, that have cyber as a piece of their business, when they lose 1, 2, 3 people, it's hard to survive that, because that could be an entire team in a discipline, in an area. So we're seeing that's the focus, Phil, is those technology pieces and either buying the skill to manage it because they've acquired the technology and they just can't keep the skill in-house and they want somebody else that's going to take that on and always have a person. So whether it's person A, B, or C today, they'll always have that person that can take on that skill where they don't have to worry about losing it, or to the extreme of just buying the outcome. I need this capability to prevent this vulnerability or this threat in my organization. And you provide the capability, you provide the outcome for me. And I'm not concerned what technology piece is. I'm not concerned. You've got the processes figured out. You've got the governance figured out. You've got the people figured out, and you've presumably got the technology pieces out. Just give me an outcome.
The change from solution outsourcing to functional outsourcing. Yeah.
Yep.
Huge shift in mindset. Perhaps we could wrap up with a final thought from each of you. Sean, final thoughts on how does a CIO stretch that dollar and get value out of products and services that they put into their portfolio with this increasingly fluid and changing marketplace that's going on right now?
I think part of it is having to do with budget cycles and budget planning in advance. So I remember having to run large budgets and trying to throw as much CapEx as I could into my budget, because that's the only way I could get anything done. And then I'd pay the costs and depreciation the next year and then complain that I didn't have enough to hire staff. So I think this is a combination of some of the things that are happening industry-wide from a financial standpoint, and also planning ahead, which is, if I have a tranche of technology solutions that are either purpose-built or perhaps they're singularly utilized for one or two functions. For example, firewalls or network proxies, these types of technologies that tend to have a low lift to remove, but a heavy lift to configure. And then you're looking at heavy renewals. I would suggest that pause any renewal activity and task whether it's your security teams or your security partners on the other side of the aisle to investigate other approaches that are more aligned to the way that your business partners in your line of business are looking to execute. Because right now, that continuation of the way that we've done things is both an impediment to our organizations and their ability to execute on their missions, meet their obligations. But on top of which, it's also creating drag in terms of the ability to hire. Who wants to go work on a firewall that came out 20 years ago and be an expert in that technology when everything now is in the cloud and it's irrelevant? So I think it's part planning for what you need immediately, but taking a hard look of what's ahead. And often that's reflected in your budget.
Yeah, I love that future forward thinking and visionary piece. Listening to podcasts like this and getting market intelligence and baking that into your decisions and your planning is all necessary parts of a CIO's function in order to really sort of stretch that extra value out of their investments. Kevin, final thoughts?
Yeah, I'm going to take a little bit of a detour for a second here, because one of the pedestals that I get up on and behind on a regular basis is around the people. And it's not just the cyber talent or the lack thereof or the skills shortage in the industry, but more holistically, the people in organizations and making them more aware of what these threats are and awareness type training and awareness testing and having testing organizations. Because I think although becoming a big area in the cyber domain, it's long been forgotten. And back in the 90s when I was at HP, the joke was the first budget to get cut was HP training budget and or training for anyone. And I think it's a serious mistake to cut training, especially as it relates to cyber, because your people can, in fact, will be your first line of defense before technology oftentimes. So I think people are a big piece of this puzzle, and you can't just look to either a technology or even a insurance policy to be your risk mitigation strategy anymore. Those are a couple of areas that I'm very passionate about.
It's all about the people. Yeah, fantastic place to close this conversation. Thank you, gentlemen. We could discuss how rapidly our industry shifts and the actions that you need to take to stay current all day, I'm sure. It's a fascinating topic, but unfortunately we are out of time. So I'd like to thank my guests for joining us today on the CIO Evolution podcast. Kevin, Sean, thank you for your insights. Really appreciate that and for being part of our discussion today.
Thanks for listening to the CIO Evolution. Check back with your podcast provider regularly for more episodes. You can find more episodes along with other podcasts on the CXO Revolutionaries website at revolutionaries.zscaler.com. Statements by Zscaler podcasters and guests are informational only and should never be construed as legal advice. You should consult your legal advisor on matters related to you or your business. Zscaler makes no warranties, express, implied, or statutory as to the content of this podcast, and it is provided as is. Content on this podcast may contain forward-looking statements that are current as of the date of the recording and subject to change. These statements are subject to the safe harbor provisions created by the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act of 1995. Full legal disclaimers are available at revolutionaries.zscaler.com. Copyright 2021.